Bernard Palissy was born in one of the southwestern districts of France in 1509, more than 350 years ago, and more than a century before our forefathers landed on Plymouth Rock. The art of making coloured glass and of painting on glass had been for centuries in great requisition for the windows of castles and cathedrals. It was considered an occupation so honourable that poor nobles sometimes resorted to it without losing caste, though the prejudices concerning rank were at that time very strong. The manufacture was generally carried on in the depths of forests, partly for the convenience of gathering fuel for the furnaces and partly to avoid the danger of fire in towns. Around these manufactories the workmen erected their cabins, and night and day the red flames of the furnaces lighted up trees and shrubbery with a lurid glow. It is supposed that Bernard was born and reared in one of these hamlets, secluded from the world. The immense forests furnished a vast amount of chestnuts, which constituted the principal food of the peasantry. Constant labour in the open air, combined with this extreme simplicity of diet, formed healthy, vigorous men, free-hearted, simple and brave. Whether Bernard's father, who is supposed to have been a modeller of glass, was a decayed gentleman or simply a peasant is not known. Bernard by some means learned to read and write, which was not an ordinary accomplishment at that period. He also had a great talent for drawing, which he improved either by practice or instruction. In other respects his education was simply that of the peasantry around him. In his own account of his early days he says, "I had no other books than heaven and earth, which are open to all." These volumes, however, he studied with lively interest and the closest observation. He took notice of the growth of plants and the habits of animals. He soon began to paint on paper the likenesses of birds, lizards and trees. As his skill increased, he made portraits of his mother and the neighbours and the landscapes containing the houses they lived in. The preparation of colours for glass early awakened an interest in chemical combinations, but there were then no books on the subject, and he could only increase his stock of knowledge by repeated experiments. His skill in drawing enabled him to produce a variety of new patterns for glasswork, and this, combined with his knowledge of colours, rendered his services much more important than those of a common workman. But the once profitable business was now in its decline. People began to find out that the exclusion of sunshine was unwholesome, and that the obstruction of light rendered their dwellings gloomy. Moreover, windows in those days, being opened on hinges, were much more exposed to be shattered by storms. To repair stained or painted glass was an expensive process, and in order to avoid the frequent necessity of it, people fastened their windows into the wall so that they could not be opened. This excluded air as well as light and sun warmth, and gradually coloured windows fell into disuse. Bernard's father was poor, and the profits of his business were too scanty to yield a comfortable support for his family. Therefore, the young man, when he was 18 years old, strapped a scantily filled wallet upon his shoulders and marched forth into the world to seek his fortune. Francis I and Charles V were then devastating half of Europe by their wars, and the highways were filled with military adventurers and crippled soldiers. From these, the young traveller obtained his first glimpses of the violence and intrigues going on in the world beyond his native forests. He was also overtaken by a travelling cloth merchant who told him of many new things. In order to dignify his own calling, he enumerated many great men who had been employed in trade. Among others, he mentioned a renowned Athenian called the divine Plato, by reason of the excellence of his wisdom, who had sold olive oil in Egypt to defray the expenses of travelling there. "I never heard of Plato," said Bernard. "Oh, you are a wild bird from the forest," replied the trader. "You can only pipe as you have been taught by nature. But I advise you to make acquaintance with books. Our King Francis is now doing so much to encourage the arts and sciences that every artisan can become wise, if he makes good use of his leisure. Our shops may now be our schools." "Then I should wish the whole world to be my shop," rejoined Bernard. "I feel that earth and air are full of mysteries and wonders, full of the sublime wisdom of God." So he wandered on, reading as he had done from childhood, in the book of earth and heaven which is open to all. If lizards were basking in the sunshine, he stopped to admire their gliding motions and prismatic changes of colour. If he found a half-covered snail among the wet mosses, he lingered till he ascertained that it was gradually making a new shell from its own saliva. If a stone was curious in form or shape, he picked it up and put it in his wallet, and oftentimes he would crack them to discover their interior structure. Every new flower and seed attracted his attention and excited wonder at the marvellous varieties of nature. These things are hinted at all through his writings. He says, "In walking under the fruit trees I received a great contentment and many joyous pleasures, for I saw the squirrels gathering the fruits and leaping from branch to branch with many pretty looks and gestures. I saw nuts gathered by the rooks, who rejoiced in taking their repast, dining on the said nuts. Under the apple trees I found hedgehogs that rolled themselves into a round form, and thrusting out their sharp quills they rolled over the apples, which stuck on the points, and so they went burdened. These things have made me such a lover of the fields, that it seems to me there are no treasures in the world so precious as the little branches of trees and plants. I hold them in more esteem than mines of gold and silver." This loving communion with nature was not mere idle dreaming. Always he was drawing inferences from what he saw, and curiously inquiring into the causes of things. He supported himself by painting glass and sketching portraits. He says in his modest way, "They thought me a better painter than I was." If he arrived in a town where a cathedral or an abbey was being built, he sometimes tarried long to make a variety of rich patterns for the windows. In other places he would find only a few repairs required in the windows of castles or churches, and so would quickly pass on. To arrange the mosaic patterns of different coloured glass required constant use of rule and compass, and this suggested the study of geometry, which he pursued with characteristic eagerness. The knowledge thus acquired made him a skilful surveyor, and he was much employed in mapping out boundaries and making plans for houses and gardens, a business which he found more profitable than glasswork or portraits. These various occupations brought him occasionally into contact with men who were learned in the arts and sciences, according to the standard of learning at that time, and his active mind never failed to glean something from such interviews. A French translation of the Scriptures had been published in 1498. He seems to have had a copy with him during his travels, and to have studied it with reverential attention. Thus constantly observing and acquiring, the young man traversed France from Spain to the Netherlands, and roamed through a portion of Germany. 10 years were spent in this way, during which he obtained the best portion of that education which he afterward turned to good account. He is supposed to have been about 29 years old when he married, and settled in the town of Saintes, in the western part of France. He supported his family by glasswork, portraits and surveying. A few years after his marriage, someone showed him an enamelled cup brought from Italy. It seemed a slight incident, but it woke the artistic spirit slumbering in his soul, and was destined to effect a complete revolution in his life. He says, "It was an earthen cup, turned and enamelled with so much beauty that from that time I entered into controversy with my own thoughts. I began to think that if I should discover how to make enamels, I could make earthen vessels very prettily, because God had gifted me with some knowledge of drawing. So regardless of the fact that I had no knowledge of clays, I began to seek for the enamel, as a man gropes in the dark." In order to begin to comprehend the difficulties he had to encounter, we must know that only the rudest kind of common pottery had then been made in France, and even with the manufacture of that he was entirely unacquainted. If he had been unmarried, he might have travelled among the potters of Europe as he had among the glassmakers, and have obtained useful hints from them, but his family increased fast, and needed his protection and support. Tea was not introduced into Europe till 100 years later, and there were no specimens of porcelain from China, except here and there a costly article imported by the rich. He was obliged to test the qualities of various kinds of clays, what chemical agents would produce enamel, what other agents would produce colours, and the action of heat on all of them. He bought quantities of earthen jars, broke them into fragments, applied to each piece some particular chemical substance, and tried them all in a furnace. He says, "I pounded all the substances I could suppose likely to make anything. Having blundered several times at great expense and through much labour, I was every day pounding and grinding new materials and constructing new furnaces, which cost much money and consumed my wood and my time." While these expenses were going on, his former occupations were necessarily suspended. Thus, the candle was burning out at both ends. His wife began to complain. Still he went on, trying new compounds, as he says, always with great cost, loss of time, confusion and sorrow. The privations of his family and the anxiety of his wife gave him so much pain that he relinquished his experiments for a while. He says, "Seeing I could not in this way come at my intention, I occupied myself in my art of painting and glassworking, and comported myself as if I were not zealous to dive any more into the secret of enamels. The king ordered extensive surveys, and he found that employment so profitable that his family were soon at ease again. But that Italian cup was always in his mind. He says, "When I found myself with a little money, I resumed my affection for pursuing in the track of the enamels. For 2 years he kept up a series of experiments under all manner of difficulties, and always without success. His wife scolded, and even his own courage began to fail. At last he applied more than 300 kinds of mixtures to more than 300 fragments, and put them all in the furnace, resolved that if this experiment proved a failure, he would try no more." He tells us, "One of the pieces came out white and polished, in a way that caused me such joy as made me think I was become a new creature." He was then 37 years old. He was merely at the beginning of what he aimed to accomplish. He had discovered how to make the enamel, but he still knew nothing of pottery, or of the effect which various degrees of heat would produce on colours. A new furnace was necessary, and he proceeded to build it with prodigious labour. Being too poor to hire help, he brought bricks on his own back from a distant kiln. He made his own mortar, and drew the water with which it was tempered. He fashioned vessels of clay to which his enamel could be applied. For more than a month he kept up an incessant fire day and night, and was continually grinding materials in a hand mill, which it usually required 2 men to turn. He believed himself to be very near complete success, and everything depended upon not letting the heat of the furnaces go down. In the desperation of his poverty and the excitement of his sanguine hopes, he burned the garden fence, and even some of the tables, doors, and floors of his house. His wife became frantic and gave him no peace. She was to be pitied, poor lady. Not being acquainted with chemical experiments, she did not know, as he did, that he was really on the point of making a great and lucrative discovery. She had heard it so long that she didn't believe it. They had a large family of children, and while their father was trying expensive experiments, several of them were dying of a disease prevalent at that time. It was a gloomy and trying period for all of them. He says, "I suffered an anguish that I cannot speak. I was quite exhausted and dried up by the heat of the furnace. It was more than a month since my shirt had been dry upon me. I was the object of mockery. Even those from whom solace was due ran crying through the town that I was burning my floors. In this way I came to be regarded as a madman. I was in debt in several places. I had 2 children at nurse and was unable to pay the nurses. Men jested at me as I passed through the streets and said it was right for me to die of hunger, since I had left following my trade. Some hope still remained to sustain me, for my last experiments had turned out tolerably well, and I thought I knew enough to get my living. But I found I was far enough from that yet." The want of means to build sheds to cover his clay vessels was another great difficulty. After working all day and late into the night, sometimes a heavy rain would spoil all his work just as he had it ready to bake. He describes himself on such occasions as utterly weak and exhausted, so that walking home he reeled like a man drunk with wine. He says, "Filled with a great sorrow, inasmuch as having laboured long I saw my labour wasted, I would retire soiled and drenched, to find in my chamber a second persecution worse than the first, which now causes me to marvel that I was not consumed by suffering." In the midst of all this tribulation, the struggling artist had one source of consolation. Jean Courvin, better known to us as John Calvin, had been preaching Protestant doctrines in France, and had given rise to the sect called the Huguenots. The extravagance and licentiousness of society at that period, and the abuses practised by a powerful and wealthy priesthood, naturally inclined this pure and simple-minded man to the doctrine of the Reformers. He became acquainted with an artisan of the same turn of mind, whom he describes as simple, unlearned, and marvellously poor. His delight was to hear Bernard read the Scriptures. Gradually his listeners increased to 10, and they formed a little society, which took turns in exhortation and prayer. One of them is supposed to have been an innkeeper, who, from religious sympathy, allowed poor Bernard to take meals at his house on credit. He still continued his experiments, and met with successive disappointments of one kind or another. At last he thought he had learned how to adjust everything just right, and confident of success, he one day put into the oven a batch of vessels, beautifully formed and painted. But a new misfortune awaited him. The materials of his furnace contained flints. These expanded and burst with the great heat, and struck into the vessels while they were soft, injuring the enamel, and covering the surface with irregular sharp points. This blow almost prostrated him, for he had expected this beautiful batch would bring a considerable sum of money for the support of his family, and put to silence those that jeered at him. But he was a man of wonderful endurance. He says, Having remained some time upon the bed, I reflected that if a man should fall into a pit, it would be his duty to try to get out again. So the brave soul roused himself and set to work diligently to earn money by his old trades of painting and surveying. Having supplied the necessities of his family, he again returned to his pottery, fully believing that his losses and hazards were over, and that he could now make articles that would bring good prices. But new disappointments awaited him. The green with which he painted his lizards burnt before the brown of the serpents melted. A strong current of air in the furnace blew ashes all over his beautiful vessels and spoiled the enamel. He says, "Before I could render any different enamels fusible at the same degree of heat, I thought I should be at the door of my sepulchre. I was so wasted in my person that there was no form or prominence in the muscles of my arms or legs. Also, the said legs were throughout of one size, so that when I walked, garters and stockings were at once down upon my heels. I often roamed about the fields, considering my miseries and weariness, and above all things, that in my own house I could have no peace, nor do anything that was considered good. I was despised and mocked by all. Nevertheless, I had a hope which caused me to work so like a man that I often did my best to laugh and amuse people who came to see me, though within me all was very sad." At the end of 10 years from the commencement of his experiments, he succeeded in making a kind of ware of mixed enamels resembling jasper. It was not what he had been aiming to accomplish, but it was considered pretty and sold well enough to support his family comfortably. While he was making continual improvements in his pottery, the Huguenots were increasing to a degree that provoked persecution. A schoolmaster in a neighbouring town, who preached on Sundays and was much beloved by the people, was brought to Saintes and publicly burnt. But Palissy and his little band were not intimidated. They continued to meet for exhortation and prayer. At first it was done mostly at midnight, but the pure and pious lives of these men and women formed such a contrast to the licentiousness and blasphemy prevailing around them that they gradually gained respect, insomuch that they influenced the magistrates of the town to pass laws restraining gambling and dissipation. So great a change was produced that, when Palissy was 51 years old, he says, "On Sundays you might see tradesmen rambling through the fields, groves and other places, in bands, singing psalms, canticles and spiritual songs, or reading and instructing each other. You might see young women seated in gardens and other places, who in like way delighted themselves with singing all holy things. The very children were so well instructed that they no longer had a puerility of manner, but a look of manly fortitude. These things had so well prospered that people had changed their old manners, even to their very countenances." After 6 years more of successive improvements, making 16 years in the whole, this persevering man at last accomplished the object for which he had toiled and suffered so much. He produced a very beautiful kind of china, which became celebrated under the name of Palissy ware. These articles were elaborately adorned with vines, flowers, butterflies, lizards, serpents, and other animals. He had always been such a loving observer of nature that we cannot wonder at being told, "He copied these in form and colour with the minute exactness of a naturalist, so that the species of each could be determined accurately." These beautiful articles sold at high prices. Orders flowed in from kings and nobles. The Constable Montmorency, a nobleman of immense wealth, employed Palissy to decorate his magnificent Château d'Ecouen, about 12 miles from Paris. There he made richly painted windows covered with scripture scenes, some of his own designing, others copied from Raphael and Albert Dürer. Vases and statuettes of his beautiful china were deposited in various places, and the floors of chapel and galleries were inlaid with china tiles of his painting. Among the groves he formed a very curious grotto of china. He modelled rocks, sloping, tortuous and lumpy, which he painted with imitations of such herbs and mosses as grow in moist places. Brilliant lizards appeared to slide over its surface, in many pleasant gestures and agreeable contortions. In the trenches of water were some living frogs and fishes and other china ones, which so closely resembled them as to not be easily distinguished. At the foot of the rocks, branches of coral of his manufacture appeared to grow in the water. A poet of that period, praising this work, says, "The real lizard on the moss has not more lustre than the lizards in that house made famous by your new work. The plants look not sweeter in the fields, and green meadows are not more preciously enamelled than those which grow under your hand." The Constable Montmorency built a convenient shop for him, where he worked with 2 of his sons. A large china dog at the door was so natural that the dogs often barked at it and challenged it to fight. Meanwhile, a terrible storm was gathering over the heads of the Huguenots. Civil war broke out between the Catholics and Protestants. Old men were burnt for quoting scripture, and young girls stabbed for singing psalms. But worldly prosperity and the flattery of the great could not tempt Palissy to renounce or conceal his faith. He pursued his artistic labours, though he says, "For 2 months I was greatly terrified, hearing nothing every day but reports of horrible murders." He would have fallen among the first victims, had it not been for written protections from powerful nobles who wanted ornamental work done which no other man could do. The horrible massacre of St. Bartholomew occurred when he was 63 years old, but he escaped by aid of his powerful patrons. The officers appointed to hunt out Huguenots longed to arrest him, but did not dare to do it in the daytime. At last they came tramping about his house at midnight and carried him off to a prison in Bordeaux. The judges would gladly have put him to death, but their proceedings were stopped by orders from the Queen Mother, Catherine de Medici. Montmorency, Montpensier, and other influential Catholic nobles who had works uncompleted, and who doubtless felt kindly towards the old artist, interceded with her, and she protected him, not because he was a good man, but because the art he practiced was unique and valuable. The enamelled Italian cup, which had troubled so many years of his life, proved the cause of its being saved. The last 10 years of Palissy's mortal existence were spent in Paris. He had an establishment in the grounds of the Tuileries, where he manufactured vases, cups, plates, and curious garden basins and baskets, ornamented with figures in relief. His high reputation drew towards him many men of taste and learning, who, knowing his interest in all the productions of nature, presented him with many curious specimens of shells, minerals, fossils, etc. He formed these into a museum, where scholars met to discuss the laws and operations of nature. This is said to have been the first society established in Paris for the pure advancement of science. When he was 66 years old, he began a course of public lectures, which he continued to deliver annually for 10 years. These were the first lectures on natural history ever delivered in Paris. The best men of the capital went there to discuss with him and hear him state, in his simple, earnest fashion, the variety of curious things he had observed in travels by mountains and seashore, through field and forest, and in his experiments on glass and china. Some pedants were disposed to undervalue his teachings because he had never learnt Greek or Latin. Undisturbed by this, he cordially invited them to come and disprove his statements if they could, saying, "I want to ascertain whether the Latins know more upon these subjects than I do. I am indeed a simple artisan, poorly enough trained in letters, but the things themselves have not less value than if they were uttered by a man more eloquent. I had rather speak truth in my rustic tongue than lie in rhetoric." He published several books on agriculture, volcanoes, the formation of rocks, the laws of water, and so on. His last book was written when he was 71 years old. Scientific knowledge was then in its infancy, but adequate judges consider his ideas far in advance of his time. A modern French scholar calls him so great a naturalist as only nature could produce. There is a refreshing simplicity about his style of writing, and his communications with the world were obviously not the result of vanity, but of general benevolence and religious reverence. He felt that all he had was from God, and that it was a duty to impart it freely. He says, "I had employed much time in the study of earths, stones, waters, and metals, and old age pressed me to multiply the talents God had given me. For that reason, I thought it would be good to bring to the light those excellent secrets, in order to bequeath them to posterity." He continued vigorous in mind and body, and was remarked for acuteness and ready wit. He abstained from theological discussions in his teachings, but made no secret of the fact that his opinions remained unchanged. Amid the frivolity, dissipation, and horrible scenes of violence that were going on in Paris, he quietly busied himself making artistic designs and imparting his knowledge of natural history, recreating himself frequently with the old pleasure of rambling in field and forest, taking loving observation of all God's little creatures. He was 76 years old when the king, Henry III, issued a decree forbidding Protestants to exercise their worship on pain of death, and banishing all who had previously practiced it. Angry bigots clamoured for the death of the brave old potter. The powerful patrons of his art again prevented his execution, but the tide was so strong against the reformers that he was sent to the Bastille. 2 Huguenot girls were in prison with him, and they mutually sustained each other with prayer and psalms. The king, in his fashionable frills and curls, occasionally visited the prisons, and he naturally felt a great desire that the distinguished old Bernard Palissy should make a recantation of his faith. One day he said to him, "My good man, you have been 45 years in the service of the Queen, my mother, or in mine, and in the midst of all the executions and massacres, we have allowed you to live in your religion. But now I am so hardly pressed by the Guise party and by my people that I am compelled, in spite of myself, to order the execution of these 2 poor young women, and of yourself also, unless you recant." "Sire," replied the old man, "that is not spoken like a king. You have often said you pitied me, but now I pity you, because you have said I am compelled. These girls and I, who have our part in the kingdom of heaven, will teach you to talk more royally. Neither the Guises, nor all your people, nor yourself can compel this old potter to bow down to your images of clay. I can die." The 2 girls were burnt a few months afterward. Palissy remained in prison for 4 years, and there he died at 80 years of age. The secrets of the Bastille were well kept, and we have no record of those years. We only know that, like John Bunyan, he wrote a great deal in prison. The thick, dark walls must have been dismal to one who so loved the free air and who valued trees and shrubs beyond silver and gold. But the martyr was not alone. He had with him the God whom he trusted, and the memories of an honest, useful, and religious life.